My name is Candice Ivy, and this is my work hum for After Spiritualism, Loss and Transcendence in Contemporary Art for the Fitchburg Art Museum. Yeah, well, you know, when she came to my house to talk, studio, it's like my house, to talk about the content of the show, like I felt like I connected with it on many different levels. I knew that she, was also bringing in different artists from the South that were dealing with the kind of historical narrative of the South, and their work was dealing very specifically with certain instances like Keith Washington. And I know that we had talked about my previous work really connecting with trauma and historical trauma, and loss and grief. And this work for me was sort of a departure to that in a huge way. Whereas I feel like I have, not that won't be included again in my work in some context, but I've spent a number of years sort of dealing with very specifically with the trauma of the Southern narrative, and also that narrative as kind of mirrored in the dynamic of my family. So this piece in particular I feel like it connected a little bit more to moving into a space of transcendence, or moving into a place where I'm able to transform my experience within that context. And so when she brought about the idea of the spiritualists, I really connected with the fact that the early spiritualists, a lot of them were women, and not that there weren't men within that, but it gave a platform for women to use their voice, and use their voice in a way that we haven't maybe historically seen in a very long time. And it also gave a space for them not only to use their voice, but to channel sort of their inner lives, which I imagine were very rich, having not been able to move as freely in the world being women. I imagine that the inner lives of women was one that was sort of rich and flourishing, and it gave the space for that to emerge and to kind of blend with sort of everyday reality. And that resonated with me really heavily. And I think that, I've alluded a little bit in the past in our conversations about my growing up in the South. And as much as I don't want my work to be rooted in that, as I think your experience, it shapes you in the environment that you of your youth really works to transform the way that you think and the way that you move in the world. And I grew up in a fundamentalist evangelical family, specifically Pentecostals, and it was a very private religious sect, and there were very strict rules. There were very strict rules around specifically women and how women could behave in public, how we could present ourselves, what even we could say, and to not be able, if we chose to use our voice in a certain way, you would be publicly shamed. So I learned very early on that my voice is not something that should be heard. So I think, like the early spiritualists, I did develop this very rich internal world. And that internal world just consisted of, I would say, my own imaginings, dreams, fantasies, my connection to the landscape. I had a very rich experience living in rural South Carolina. And to the point where I didn't really develop a way to be in the world around me. That has been something I've worked at a lot. And I think this piece, for me, was, in a large way, it's beginning to hear my own self. Not that I didn't before, but beginning to figure out ways to be more visible without being afraid to be visible. And to blend that rich internal world and that rich sensorial experience of connecting with my environment, and to give it a visual form, and to kind of echo those sort of magical and beautiful transformative processes that I think are in the natural world, but also mirrored within myself. Yeah, material is really important. I think my experience of the natural world has been one of a place of deep connection, and I've always been a very tactile person. And I love the way that you enter a landscape, and when you enter a landscape, through your senses, that landscape enters you. I think of, for example, I was in Ireland last summer and observing the lichen on the rocks, or the vivid green and lush of the trees, or the moss, or in the landscape of my youth, sort of the drippy Spanish moss, and just the kind of character and personality of the surrounding world that is not only in these forms, but is this form in relationship to the whole ecosystem. And I connect with my surroundings in that way. And so when I work on a piece, I go directly to material. And since much of my life has been informed by being outside, and that's just where my visual language and visual vocabulary has emerged, I'm pulling constantly from the surrounding landscape. I'm pulling constantly from places I've been and experienced, not just the landscape of my youth, but I've lived in the Northeast for 20 years. But I wanted to create the experience that when you see the piece, it is as if you're in the natural world, and the material enters you as much as you are being pulled into it, so that this sort of conversation begins to happen, and that your body activates it, or it activates you, so that there's this sort of back and forth exchange. So the materials that I've used for this piece is glass. And glass these are broken windshields. They came from car accidents, and I've worked with the natural breaks in the material, so I was really interested in it metaphorically as sort of weaving together many narratives. I cut down the trees from my, I have about 6 acres and a lot of woods, so I went out in the woods and cut down 6 birch trees. And finding the right tree and the right shape and the right color, like all of that played a huge role into it. So when I started this piece, it started with looking for the right trees. And then before I even started the piece, I went through the process of stripping the bark off the tree. I saved everything. When I sanded the tree down, I saved all of the sawdust. I have all of that now. Even now, I've used every single piece of the tree, those 6 trees in other creative projects. But choosing the trees and then allowing that to kind of inform the direction. That's the starting point. That's the structure. So I like that the tree has this sort of history to a landscape that I'm connected to and I'm bound to right now, and I have a direct relationship to. And the clay the majority of it is porcelain, and you know, I think a lot of that comes from I think the first material I've ever worked with was really clay, and the red clay in the Carolinas. And so I went on a hiatus from using clay for a while and returned to it in the last 5 years. And I found that nothing makes me feel grounded more than using clay. And I like that all the components in this piece are very like earth-bound in some way. You know, the trees are growing from the earth. The primary ingredient in glass is silica, which is also one of the primary ingredients in clay. So it's all from the earth in some capacity, or a transformed relationship to the earth. I really love that the glass has gone through this process of heat and sort of an introduction to the elements that transforms into something else. I think the same is true with clay, that starts off in one form, and then over this alchemical process, it becomes something else. I think all of the pieces that are all the materials that are in this piece are in some way connected to transformation, but transformation in relation to some sort of elemental force. It was really important to me to work with porcelain because it has this sort of just historical elegance and kind of fragility, and we associated it with just sort of pureness, and it is some of the first clay that you get off the mountain before the river has carried it down and added all of these different components. So that seemed to be important as well to the piece. So every element that I brought into it, they needed to speak. The parts needed to speak to one another, and they needed to share a kind of quality about it as well. So that I didn't necessarily have to tell you that, but you can look at it and you can imply that as well. There's already kind of an ecosystem happening within the form. I also think that I was thinking a lot about elements, like the elements of water or the elements of air, the elements of fire even in the transformation of the materials. I was thinking a lot about the dichotomies of the material tricking you into feeling soft, yet it's kind of hard at the same time. But the center kind of opens up into a softness, like visually. It's also, it feels sort of aquatic and watery, at the same time it's sharp and can hurt you. So there's a little bit of violence in it, as well as there is sort of a serenity and kind of a peace or a beauty. And it was important that the piece held those dichotomies, because I think that in the space of transformation, those two things are held or suspended and are blended or sort of come together to form a third, you know. A lot of my inner world is made up of, I would say, dreams and fantasies and stories and characters within those stories. And I didn't organically, or I guess I didn't deliberately come at a space where it's like, I'm dealing with ecofeminine. I think as parts of me kind of wake up. And I need to integrate that into my everyday life in these sort of different awarenesses that are granted through, hard personal work or making, and then having a dialogue with my work. I think I very organically became aware of this force that I would describe as the feminine within myself. I've done a lot of reading, and I guess in recent last couple years, I didn't really know that there was a term called ecofeminism until about a couple years ago. And then when I came upon it, I was like, oh, wow, okay, this is what I'm responding to. This sense of this activity or this sense of transformation that I'm responding to in the world around me that I'm observing, and this blending with the natural environment. The feminine to me is a kind of, I guess I experience it as a kind of creative force. And it is a part of me that I've had to learn to negotiate as I'm making forms, because I think that it is the force that helps me to animate the forms or the material itself. So when I experience it, it's not a thing. It's kind of it's far-reaching. It's a space. It's the thing that animates. And I think a part of finding my voice is learning to be in conversation with that, and to allow that to live in me in a new way. And the last 3 projects that I've worked on, starting, I would say, very specifically with Deluge, and then within, above, below the skin, and then with this one, Hum, I refer to them all as she. I don't know how to tell you how that makes sense. It just does. To me, the work has begun to take on an entity in its own. As soon as I'm done with it, I think of it as its own thing. And I would say up until Deluge, I didn't see my process that way. And when I make these pieces and I step away from them, I'm able to see how this thing is that I just made is active within myself. And it has different faces and different colors and different contradictions. And when I made Deluge, it was like this dark mother, this sort of screaming spider, a dark black widow. And I had to come to terms with that aspect of myself and that aspect of the world around me. I think within, above, below the skin was really beginning to see my skin as this permeable barrier, and how I am constantly in relationship to my surroundings, that my perceived skin is not that thick. You know, things are entering me and animating me from the, I would say, the activity in our culture, from the dynamics in my family. It's this whole ecosystem that I'm interacting with. And then thinking about my voice in relation to that. What does that look like? What does that form feel like in my body? It's harder to articulate it than it is to make a form that tries to describe it in some way. So I think Hum was trying to almost like distill it down even further to sort of its essence. Like, how does it really move? How does it really sound? How does it really feel? So everything about this piece had to just be super sensorial, but it also had to connect to the somatic experience of the body. I mean, I think that when you see the piece, it has elements that looks like a pelvic opening, but it could also be, I think it could also relate to different animals, or it could relate to different elements. It had to sort of hold all of these different things that it is at once, you know? And I think that that's where the name came from, is when I was in the middle of making this piece, and Lisa had asked me to write something for it. I was like, I have no words at all, but I can give you a poem that, and I love poetry, and that it kind of elicits form with language. So to me, to distill it down, it is this somatic movement within your own body. it's like a hum. It's like a vibration. It's like the center of things, just sort of moving or vibrating. And that's where the name came from. That it's not naming it as much as it's telling you what it is. So it's more describing its being than, kind of hovering around the space of what and how it was made or the themes that it was trying to embody. Yeah, I think you can connect it to death and transcendence. I think death is a kind of transformation. It's a meeting of a liminal space, and I think transformation happens in that liminal space. So when I'm referring to dichotomies, these two things, it's where those two things meet. That, to me, you can interpret as a kind of death. I think that we always respond to work based on where we are, not only in ourselves, but what's happening in our cultural surroundings. I think about the way that we look at work from the past, work that was made 100 years ago, 40, 50 years ago. We're always reinterpreting based on where we are now. So I can't not imagine that this entire exhibition would have new resonance, where you have all of these cultural forces sort of bubbling to the surface and asking to be seen. And I think it's a pivotal moment for transformation and for all of these gray areas and these nuances and these contradictions to be unveiled in a way. And so I think all of the elements in the show speak to that and play to different components of that that space that's emerging culturally right now.